May it please your majesty, you've come a long way, baby, from Andrew Morton's kiss and tell bio of Diana to your 50th Jubilee.
I am more than conscious at the moment of the importance of football. Although this weekend comes about halfway through my Jubilee year, as far as we are concerned, it bears no relation to a rest at half-time. However, I am very glad that the 50th anniversary of my accession is giving so many people all over this country and in the Commonwealth an excuse to celebrate and enjoy themselves.
And enjoy themselves they did. 1 million people paraded through the streets and pranced the stage in your honor, making it appear that things indeed have changed, that a public that used to scoff and scorn your family are now on board. Or are they? I'm sure you know that the monarchy comes with, well, controversy. There are those who say you're less of a symbol of British strength than an icon of upturned noses, silly wardrobes, and brutal class oppression. Sure, some call you an integral part of Britain's democracy, but do even you believe that, Your Highness? The ways of Buckingham probably won't change in your lifetime, but the debate over whether you should be there at all continues to stew. Monarchy, to be or not to be? That is the question. Connection listeners, what are the pleasures and pitfalls of the British royal family? Is it time for the sun to finally set on the House of Windsor? Call us at 1-800-423-8255, 1-800-423-TALK, and tell us your answer. We're going to be joined from a studio in London by Stephen Hessler, Professor of Local Government at London's Guildhall University and Chair of Republic, a non-party group campaigning for an elected head of state, and Peter Hitchens, columnist for London's Mail on Sunday newspaper and author of Abolition of Britain. But first I want to turn to WBUR correspondent and Inside Out documentary host Michael Goldfarb, who's in London right now. Hello, Michael.
Hey, Anthony. How are you?
I'm very well. Well, let me get you to give us your take on all the excitement of the last 4 days. We saw pictures of millions of adoring Britons waving Union Jacks. It seemed like a great event from the point of view of a public relations spectacle for the royals. What struck you about it all?
Well, actually, I think that a lot of us were struck by just how much fun the last, particularly the Monday and Tuesday were. These were the holidays called to honor the 50th anniversary of the Queen's accession. And I must say it was a slow time of building. The Queen had been making a tour of her island kingdom here, and over the last few weeks, dutifully, the evening news showed pictures of the Queen in this small town or that small town, and gosh, the crowds were really small, and I sort of felt, you had to feel a little sad for her that, she goes out on her 50th anniversary, and, people have moved on in terms of what they think and how they relate to the monarchy. But then things really began to build, and I must say that over the last 48 hours, it has been a really strong and genuine outpouring of affection, I think, as much for her as for the institution. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Queen is that people do understand that she is a person, and, if they stop and think about the vicissitudes that have overtaken her, say, in the last decade, with the fact that her children's marriages, 3 out of 4 of them have fallen apart, the tragic death of Princess Diana, and more recently the death of her beloved mother, I think they just wanted to tell her that, we appreciate your steadfastness. And in addition, there was a lot of opportunity to party because there were big concerts and so on.
Michael, you've been in London for quite a while. So, there had been concern not long ago that this Golden Jubilee celebration would suffer from public apathy, but that wasn't the case at all. What happened?
Well, I think that you have to understand, the British relate to the monarchy, sort of the way the Aztecs used to relate to their human sacrifices. They treat them as living gods, right? And then tear their hearts out with tabloid newspaper reports. And I think that there's a genuine love and feeling for the institution of the monarchy. I've come to the conclusion that the monarchy is to Britain what our Constitution is to the United States. It is, it has its factual basis, but it's also the kind of mythic symbol of who we are. And if you take the Constitution or rewrite the Constitution into some completely different document, I think people would feel that we're no longer the United States. And similarly, if you take the monarchy away in its entirety, I think most people in this country would feel, well, what does it mean to be British then, if not to have a head of state who is a monarch, because it connects people back to, the 1,000-year evolution of this nation.
Let me go to Stephen Hessler. Michael, stand by. We want to come back to you and love you to stand by and chime in on this conversation. But I'd like to go to Stephen Hessler, who's professor of local government at London's Guildhall University and chair of Republic, a non-party group who's campaigning for an elected head of state. Stephen, you heard what my colleague Michael Goldfarb said. You take the monarchy away from Britain, it would be like taking the Constitution away from the U.S.
Wow, that's a very big statement. I suppose I don't know whether I agree with that exactly. I don't think I can really get my head around the idea that 60 million British people are dependent for their identity upon one inherited, one family originating from Germany, who pass on the head of stateship from mother to eldest son. I find this an extraordinary statement, frankly, and in fact don't agree with it. This is modern Britain is a country of huge variety and huge diversity. There is a dwindling group now, very old people who feel very fervently in favour of the royal family because, for some peculiar reason, they associate them with having won the war. But apart from that,
Steve, let me just stop you there, because I do want to just try to challenge you on that point. And again, this is someone who's 3,000 miles away, who's been watching CNN. I saw 1 million people in the street, young and old. I've heard about polls that show 70% approval for the royal family. How does that square with what you just said?
Well, we just commissioned a poll from the most reputable polling organisation in Britain, which showed that the majority of British people believe there ought to be an elected head of state when the Queen goes. Now, the fact of the matter is there is sympathy for the Queen, but this was a huge public relations event. The BBC, let me give you one single example of how you got these people out on the street, and a lot of them were tourists, by the way. London is taken over hugely by tourists. Anybody who comes to central London and what I call the tourist zone, which is Buckingham Palace, knows that. A lot of them are your fellow countrymen. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the major media outlet in this country, paid for and sponsored the 2 concerts in the grounds of Buckingham Palace. Every newspaper ran the story of this coming Jubilee, and some newspapers, for days and weeks in advance, were telling people how to party, where it's going to be, how to turn up, what to dress. Hugely organised, brilliant PR spectacle. More people were at home, not interested in the Jubilee, interested in the World Cup, than the Jubilee. And so I think we've got carried away a little bit by these millions in the Strand.
Peter Hitchens, let me come to you. Peter Hitchens, you're a columnist for London's Mail on Sunday newspaper and author of Abolition on Britain. A huge public... I'm sorry?
The abolition of Britain.
Abolition of Britain, forgive me. Stephen Hessler calls this a huge public relations extravaganza. Was that all it was?
No, it wasn't. I'm sorry for Stephen that he doesn't actually see anything to celebrate in this. What we were celebrating was the fact that we are a free people living under laws chosen by and large by ourselves. The Queen and the monarchy are not merely the symbols of that, but the guarantee of it. We did try a republic for a brief period in the 17th century and ended up with a military dictatorship, and we feel that we don't want another one of those. Thank you very much. And it is a genuinely popular institution. It represents all kinds of things which people like, such as family and continuity and inheritance and history, and the fact that we have a past and we hope to have a future, and people enjoyed it. And it had a wonderful innocence about it. Stephen talks about tourists. I was down yesterday afternoon in the city of London, which on public holidays is generally deserted. There weren't tourists lining the streets. They were perfectly straightforward British people of all generations who'd come to see something unique, which they were not likely to see again in their own lifetimes, and to celebrate it because they believe in it and they think that it is part of their identity. And why not? It's something that we can be proud of, to have been free and to have lived under laws of our own choosing for hundreds of years. It is one of the things which make us unique.
Stephen Hessler, the idea of a national leader who sits above political disputes and and the parochial concerns, perhaps, of everyday politicians, who stands for tradition and the long, storied history of British stability. It doesn't sound so bad when it's phrased like that.
The tradition of this country, the stability of this country, is not based upon one German-derived family. It is based on our people, their inventions, their entrepreneurship, the things they've done with their lives. Our own people's traditions is what makes this country stable, and is indeed the history of this country. But look, on this question of someone above the law, this is a problem we have with this head of state, because I'd like to ask maybe your American guest who's over here in London a question about his own country, that if the President of the United States, your own head of state, did not abide by the tax laws of his own country, how long do you think it would be before they were impeached?
Michael Goldfarb, let me come to you, and you can answer that question or comment in general about your take on the debate as you hear it in the streets of London.
I mean, there's a couple of things to say there. I mean, I'm afraid I don't know how to answer that question, Stephen, since there is absolutely there's no analogy at all between the way the president is selected, the way our country with a written constitution, it should be said, as opposed to Britain, which has an accretion of laws which people in Britain would call a constitution, but which I don't recognize as being a constitution, and you probably don't either. But I mean, I think that in making the point about whether it's correct in the 21st century for a nation like Britain, a leading industrial nation, to be ruled and governed in this way, as opposed to having an elected head of state, is a worthwhile discussion. But I just want to correct you on one thing, Stephen, and that is that usually, you're right, that when people in the royal family die, it's become kind of a joke for us journalists. We go down to Vox Pop people at Buckingham Palace, and it usually takes 12 hours before you can actually find a Brit to say, how do you feel about the Queen Mother dying? Because usually it's an American who's there. However, yesterday and the day before, it was almost exclusively a British celebration. And certainly yesterday, I mean, it was more than public relations.
Well,
I mean, there were 20,000 school children, and all of them had their parents out in the city, and there were a lot of people brought together to celebrate the country. And I think that is, you can't be overly cynical about that, Stephen.
Oh, look,
and as for being above the law, well, the interesting thing about British history, to make a very large generalization, is that rather like our Constitution, you can kind of change what the nature of the monarchy is. It's sufficiently flexible. And whether it's barons holding King John to take up a pen at Runnymede and sign Magna Carta, or, Parliament inviting somebody from Holland to come over and sit on the throne, which is vacant, there's a malleability to the monarchy, which I think you also have to acknowledge, and a kind of pragmatic notion. Peter brought up, the bloody interregnum of Cromwell, and I think that it is interesting to note how we think of kings and queens as having a certain absolute power, and of course they don't, and particularly the British monarch doesn't, and has become something of a symbol.
Michael Holt, I want to thank you for joining this conversation. I want to ask Stephen Hessler and Peter Hitchens to stand by. We want to come back to them, continue this discussion, this debate. We'll also be taking your calls at 1-800-423-8255, 800-423-TALK. Connection listeners, what does Britain's royal family mean to you? Tourist attraction or a legitimate symbol of national identity? This is NPR. This is The Connection. I'm Anthony Brooks.
From Boston University.
This is The Connection. I'm Anthony Brooks. I'm joined by Stephen Hessler, Professor of Local Government at London's Guildhall University and Chair of Republic, and Peter Hitchens, columnist for London's Mail on Sunday newspaper. Peter Hitchens, I want to come to you. I haven't forgotten about you, but let me first just go back to Stephen Hessler, because my colleague before the break, Michael Goldfarb, raised some points that I wanted him to respond to. In particular, it seemed like Michael was suggesting, what powers does the Queen really have that you find so worrisome?
Well, she obviously has immense social power, behind-the-scenes power. She's also head of the Commonwealth, you know, and also, peculiar enough, Americans may not understand this, but she's technically also head of the Church of England. She has immense personal sway over the politicians, most of whom are terribly frightened of offending her or doing anything she wouldn't agree with. So it's a lot of behind-the-scenes power, together with the formal powers that accrue to the Crown in this country, which are mainly used by the Prime Minister. And to give you an example, the ability to declare war only needs, by this country, only needs two signatures, the Prime Minister and the Queen, and the making, and not only making, very interesting again for Americans, the ratification of treaties only needs two signatures, Prime Minister and Queen's. So there's a lot of informal and real power that the Queen holds over this country, apart from the major power, which is my problem with her, which she continually makes this country live in the past when we've got some very big decisions to make about our future relationship with Europe.
Peter Hitchens, respond to that, this notion that hereditary power is invested with the kind of authority that Stephen Hessler was just outlining. Does sound very troubling, I would suspect, to a lot of folks, at least on this side of the Atlantic. Has he stated it correctly in your view?
No, I think only a Martian examining the laws of the country could conceivably come up with the conclusion that the Queen has any power. The whole point about her is that she doesn't have any. The Prime Minister exercises a huge amount of power, far more than a US President, for instance, and far more than he should, because we have at the moment a very feeble Parliament, and the whole point of our system is that Parliament should be strong, and it isn't. The idea that taking the power away from the Queen would do anything other than give more power to the Prime Minister is the big fallacy of Stephen's argument. No, what she does is she does what the Prime Minister tells her to do, and she does what Parliament tells her to do, and she has absolutely no realistic power to prohibit any of the things that he wants to do. If he wanted to declare war, she couldn't stop him. If he wants to put bills through Parliament, she can't veto them. It's mythical. What she does is she occupies a space in our Constitution roughly like the space the King occupies on the chessboard. By being there, she prevents other people from occupying. She has no power to strike or act, but she has the power to prevent them from being there. If there weren't a Queen there, and we actually had an elected head of state controlled by our immensely powerful and tightly knit and largely closed political parties, then we would have something approaching a dictatorship. But it's a restraint on the power of Downing Street.
Sure, I understand the point, but I mean, aren't there circumstances in which she could exercise real power? For example, a hung parliament. I mean, she would be in a position to call for elections or not call for elections. Is that correct?
Hang on.
One at a time.
The point, what she can do is, on the advice of the Prime Minister, she can dissolve Parliament. That means the Prime Minister has to decide to dissolve it. If there were a hung Parliament, then she could indeed decide to call someone to form a government, but he has to be able to get a parliamentary majority. If she called someone to form a government who had no parliamentary majority, then it would fall. That's not power. That just actually gives her a position of being a constitutional umpire who can rule between the parties without anybody suspecting that she's biased one way or another, which is rather important in a system where ultimate power depends on a parliamentary majority.
Well, she has actually selected one Prime Minister from complete to no one quite knows how it was done when Sir Alec Douglas-Home suddenly appeared as our Prime Minister with no vote in the Conservative Party. Now, admittedly, that has changed. The Queen has selected a Prime Minister for this country without a vote in the majority party. That is a fact on the record. Very rarely.
Yes, but
no, hold on a minute. Let me just finish.
I have to
respond to it in a minute.
But Peter Hitchens, let Stephen Hessler just finish his point. And then,
it's very important that this isn't misrepresented. Yeah. The British parliamentary system depends on a majority in Parliament. At the time that this happened, the Conservative Party had a majority in Parliament. It would have been a Conservative Prime Minister anyway, and it wasn't a question of defying the will of the electorate. She was simply selecting someone from the party which had a majority in Parliament.
So that Peter doesn't come in again, I'll slightly we can challenge that again for a longer programme. But look, this is not the only issue here, the powers of the Queen, which are behind-the-scenes powers. Let me give you an example of the power of this woman over our elected Prime Minister. In 1993, I think it was, she had a special deal with John Major, our former Prime Minister, which has not been changed by Tony Blair, still frightened of her popularity with certain sections of the British people, in which she avoids the tax laws that all the rest of us have to live under. For instance, her mother recently died, and she is not going to pay inheritance tax on the money she receives from her mother. This is because of a secret deal done with the Prime Minister, which is frankly quite outrageous, that a head of state should be above the law, being able to negotiate with the Prime Minister which taxes she pays and which taxes she doesn't. Now, that is just a sign of the informal power. What I'm suggesting is there's a whole other range of powers and that she exercises on Commonwealth matters, on Church of England matters, on matters she feels strongly about, like the union of the UK, in which she, because of her popularity with certain sections of the public, the British Prime Minister listens to, inordinately so, in these secret meetings he has with her once a term. And that's apart from all the informal social tone powers she has as a symbol of our nation.
Okay, gentlemen, stand by. I want to let some callers into this conversation. 1-800-423-8255, 800-423-TALK is the way to join this connection conversation on the royal family. Hope, first of all, Hope is calling from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Hello, Hope.
Yes, hello. I have mixed feelings about this because my son-in-law, Michael Flanders, was very satiric about the royal family, but he did a lot for the disabled and got a royal award for that. But a position, OBE. But then he died, and my daughter took over his work for the disabled, and she also got the OBE, and I had a chance to see what was going on in the palace, the Buckingham Palace, and I was quite amazed at how well she was doing her job.
Now, what's her job, Hope, as you see it?
Her job being the award, giving these honors to people, and she also had the staff of Buckingham Palace was the ones we saw, and we saw quite a few of them because we were treated by them as big guests. Were many of them disabled and people who had earned their right to be there because they were citizens, but when she awarded the honors, she really did it in a way that made you feel that this was worth something. I mean,
okay, Hope, I really appreciate your call, and we take the point. It's a good one, Peter Hitchens. Is that the value of the Queen, a sort of ribbon cutter and bestower of awards? Speak to Hope's point.
It's one of many of her values, that what she can do is she can give us a seal of approval to individual acts of goodness and actually provide an ethos in society which is above money and above power. All that governments do is they tend to reward those who give them money, and they tend to and those who give them votes, and they tend to suck up to those who give them power or who help them exercise it. One of the things about a head of state who is above politics is that they can pursue what you might call moral objectives, and many small but vitally important charitable acts of goodness are rewarded in this way by the Crown, not with money but by little medals and awards and initials people can put after their names, which do absolutely no harm, involve no corruption, and do a great deal of good. It is one of the aspects of having a non-political head of state which is very valuable and highly valued by those who are particularly in charitable work, who find that often they get support from not merely from the Queen but other members of the royal family, which makes their life a good deal easier. So yes, it is, but it's not the only thing.
Stephen Hessler, what about all these other members of the royal family, the court and so forth? I mean, is this, I gather you would say this isn't worth, £50 million a year that the British subjects are asked to pay?
Well, it's much more than that, because they use all kinds of government offices and all that kind of stuff, and government apartments free. It's very difficult to quantify royal finances. It's a quagmire. But no, there's a lot of hangers-on. There are lots of dukes of this, duchesses of that, as though we're still in the sort of early part of the 19th century. This is a problem. I mean, I think even many monarchists, fervent monarchists, strange term, isn't it, in the 21st century to have people who are monarchists, but there are them here. Even fervent monarchists support getting rid of some of the other royals from the public money and from official duties. And there is an extended family, but you see, the problem with this is that the monarchy is based on a family. So it's very difficult to disentangle some members of the extended family from the monarch themselves. It is a family dynasty. What happens here is that our head of state, the representative of our country, abroad and at home, comes from one single family. You can't get away from that. And I just think it's a very strange, without talking about the individuals concerned here even, although I'm critical of some of them, without even talking about their merits or demerits, it's a very strange system. But I suppose Peter thinks here is another British first. We're pioneering a new way of living with governance in the 21st century. God save the Queen.
1-800-423-8255. Alan is calling from Cambridge. Hello, Alan.
Yes, how are you?
Very well.
My question is not if England should become a republic, but when will it become a republic? It's inevitable. And what will the Queen do about it?
Well, how inevitable is it? Let me start with you, Stephen Hessler, since you're pushing for republic. What kind of strength? How would you rate the strength of your movement?
Oh, I will put my academic hat on for a moment, if I may, and make it fair. What I try to be an objective assessment of this. I don't think Britain will be a republic while the Queen is under 80. But I think if she's over 80, people will start saying, look, a lot of people retire in their 70s, and so should you. And that when Charles takes over, that is when we have the real crisis of the British monarchy. My only point is we could allow this Queen to have a good reign now. We could prepare for a republic when she goes, but we're not doing so. So I think the crisis in monarchy, the real crisis in monarchy, comes when the Queen hands over to Charles, and I think that may be sometime in her late 70s. If she carries on much longer than that, for fear of the monarchy ending if she hands over to Charles, I think people will begin to say, well, look, you've had a huge run now, you're in your 80s, and we ought to have something new. That's when the crisis comes. I think it's about 5 or 6 years away.
Peter Hitchens, is it a crisis in the making? Is it inevitable, this move to republic, in your view?
No, absolutely not inevitable. No, there are plenty of people who would like it to happen. When I say plenty, the present is a small minority, but enough of them in positions of influence and power, particularly in the media world and in London. You won't find many Republicans outside our equivalent of the Beltway. They're not generally to be found, but in London there are a lot of them. They tend to have other objectives in mind. One of their main objectives is the absorption of this country into the European Union, which would ultimately end our independence and end our constitution and our liberty and indeed our entire legal system. So obviously the monarchy is an obstacle to that because it is the keystone of our constitution and would have to go before they achieved it. That's why they're Republicans. You won't find many people who are Republicans pure and simple. Most of them have other agendas, things they wish to change. They tend to be as socially or morally or in other ways politically radical. Most people would tend to say, if asked, well, why mess around with it? Why spit on your luck? It works very well. It's served us extremely well for many centuries. Why should we get rid of it now? The danger is that because the political world and the media world in London are in many cases so determined to get rid of Britain as it has existed for all this time, that they will succeed in producing the crisis which will lead to a republic. Many of them leapt on the Diana bandwagon when she died and sought to use her coffin as a sort of battering ram against the monarchy. Fortunately, they failed to do it, and one of the interesting things about the past couple of days is I think that's put an end to all the suggestions that Diana had in fact done permanent damage to the monarchy, because the obvious popularity shows that they've survived it. But I wouldn't say there was no long-term danger. I think there are a lot of people who would like to get rid of it, and I don't ignore them or belittle them.
Alan, thank you.
It's important for supporters of the monarchy to make a good case for it if they want it to survive.
Sure. Alan, thanks for the call. Let's go to Virginia, who's calling from Louisville, Kentucky.
Hi. I'm actually from Canada. I live in the United States, and I wondered if any of your speakers were aware of that in Canada, the large majority of people also support the monarchy. And my cousin...
Do you count yourself among the supporters?
Yeah, I would. I'm a baby boomer, so I went through, my rebellious period. And from my vantage point living in the United States, I'd say I agree with Canadians.
And tell me why. Explain that point of view.
Canada is the same kind of setup, essentially, as Britain. We thankfully now can review our Constitution ourselves. We used to have to take it to the Privy Council. But it adds a stability to the Canadian system that I think that your speakers have been talking about, and which is very important, particularly in Canada, which has had the demise almost of the Conservative Party in Canada, the rise of all of these radical Western parties. I'm from the West, so I can say that. The Queen and her representative in Canada, the Governor General, who also, by the way, is very popular, she's a woman, that adds something that Canadians like, and they look south to the United States, and they think, not bad.
Interesting. Stephen Hessler, respond, if you would, to Virginia from Louisville. I mean, of course, obviously, this isn't just the Queen of Great Britain. This is the Queen of and the United Kingdom. This is the Queen of the whole of the British Empire. Are you in touch with efforts across the Commonwealth, I meant to say, in touch with folks across the Commonwealth who share your views?
Oh, yes, particularly with the Australian Republican movement, which you may know last year or so, I think it was a couple of years ago now, almost won a referendum to abolish the monarchy. They lost it because they made a foolish put forward a foolish option for the future, but they came within a few percentage points of winning in a referendum in Australia. They'll be coming back on that, and will win it next time. Australia will be a republic. This I can firmly commit to. Australia will be a republic in, I reckon, about 6 years' time, and then we'll see Canada. If Canada, forgiving your last caller, can overcome its problem with the United States, which it always wants to be not the United States, if it can overcome that issue of its problem with the United States, will probably follow suit. And of course, after the Queen goes, we also have the problem of who's the head of the Commonwealth, because no Commonwealth leader I know of wants the British head of state to be head of the Commonwealth when the Queen goes.
Virginia, thanks for your call. Stephen Hessler and Peter Hitchens, please stand by. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more Connection listeners calling in at 800-423-8255, 800-423-TALK. This is The Connection from NPR. I'm Anthony Brooks.
Funding for The Connection is made possible by Macromedia, the software company helping to redefine what the web can be. Available on the web at www.macromedia.com.
This is The Connection. I'm Anthony Brooks. We're talking about Britain's royal family, and we're joined by Peter Hitchens and Stephen Hessler, both on the line from London. Gentlemen, let me start with you, Peter Hitchens. You know, we just after that last break, we heard a song by the Sex Pistols. This brings to mind highly critical opinions that have been expressed over the years by the likes of Elvis Costello. John Lennon once was performing to an audience that included a group of royals, and he said, "You don't have to applaud, you just have to rattle your jewelry," or words to that effect. During the celebration of the last 4 days, Paul McCartney is now Sir Paul. He was there. People like Eric Clapton. I mean, these pop icons have now come aboard in such a big way. Can you make sense of that for me?
Well, I don't think it really does make any particular sense, except that they've realized that there's something around that's stronger than them. What was interesting, actually, seeing the rock performers at Buckingham Palace on Monday night, was so many of them looked fantastically old, outdated, and heading towards retirement. The Queen seemed to have survived the past 50 years a good deal better than they'd survived the past 30. I think that one of the things about the continuity and power of the institution of monarchy in a free society is that it eventually gets through even to the most childish of its opponents. They realize they're up against something bigger than them, which is no bad thing for them to realize. It's bigger than them, not because it's they're bowing to some woman, some Austro-Hungarian autocrat or some czar, but they're bowing to the symbol of English liberty, which is, as I say, something worth actually acknowledging. And it isn't. A lot of the attacks on monarchy are frankly infantile and illiterate and childish. I accept Stephen from that, who thinks very carefully about what he says and has, as I say, a much more complicated agenda. But the kind of rattle your jewelry, disrespect sort of stuff is it doesn't last very long, and people, if they grow up at all, grow out of it.
But Stephen Hessler, doesn't it? I mean, it seems like, at least the royal family is more sensitive to the need to appeal to a popular audience. Or again, this is a perspective from 3,000 miles away. Put it in your own terms.
Well, they've had some new advisors who have, I think foolishly in the long term, advised them to become more touchy-feely with young people. And they have now turned themselves, they may have turned themselves through the events of the last few days, when we look back on it, into the celebrity monarchy, having been the family monarchy in the 60s and 70s. That obviously failed for reasons I don't have to go into. But the problem with the celebrity monarchy, which is inviting pop stars onto the roof of your head of state mansion, is that celebrity is a very fragile thing. It comes and goes very quickly. It's not the kind of thing likely to appeal to those who argue like Peter Hitchens, the older people of this country, who appeals to the sort of enduring value of the monarchy. So I think there's in a way, I think this appeal to celebrity, pop star and rock concert monarchy is really rather defensive. I mean, I think looking back on it again, I think this whole last 4 weeks, 4 weeks, of course, and then 4 days, has been a fairly defensive operation. The Queen herself is on record. She hasn't rebuked the person who said it as to be worried about whether the Jubilee was going to be a success or not. And I think they did this in order to get some of the crowds on the streets who I'm sure weren't sure what they were actually celebrating. People like a party, particularly if you've got a couple of days off as a bank holiday given to you by government. It's free. You have a kids' party, and if you have children, with their flags, the parents are going to turn up to see the kids. Quite reasonable, good stuff. I'm not sure this is going to help the monarchy in the long run. It rather cheapens it.
1-800-423-8255, 800-423-TALK. Kate is calling from Orangeburg, South Carolina. Hello, Kate.
Hello. I just have a statement, really, as to why I do respect the Queen and her family.
Now, wait a minute. You are British.
Yes, I am,
right.
But I've been living here for 5 years. I think that the Queen and her descendants are different because they are trained and educated from birth specifically for the job. And I see the Queen as the most educated, well-read, well-travelled person in the country. She's very wise in domestic and international affairs. And I wish she could represent us at more important decision-making meetings. And I don't think an adult elected would get the same guarantee of quality.
Kate, do you have the same confidence in Charles? Because my guest, Stephen Hessler, talked about the coronation of Charles as a real crisis in the making.
I do have the same confidence in Charles. As we get younger and younger throughout the family, perhaps slightly less so. I don't feel a need for the royal family to be touchy-feely and going to pubs and necessarily so in with the public. I don't think that's necessary because I think their education is so well focused throughout their lives that I have great confidence in their wisdom.
Stephen Hessler, what would you say to Kate?
What about the wisdom of the royal family?
Well, just about the fact that their experience and they're trained from birth to do a job that needs doing.
Well, they may have been, but I just take the view, I'm afraid, that you can get bad monarchs as well as good ones. And what do you do if you get a bad one? Here's the problem, you see. I believe that we really ought to have a head of state who represents us for a limited period of time, 5 years or so. We can kick him out, put a new one in. The problem I have with all this so-called wisdom is often it isn't wisdom at all. It's just fake wisdom. And even if it was wisdom, it's still not a reason to have someone as your head of state. You do not have somebody as your head of state to be there forever with responsibilities to no one, accountable to no one. It's just a different view, really. I understand what your caller's saying, but it's a different view of society and whether our country is a democracy or not. If you are a democracy, then we should elect our head of state. Now, we might want to be a half democracy. I think that's probably what we are in this country, a half democracy, really, in which our head of state comes from one family only, goes down to the eldest son, all the women are excluded, even if they're the eldest, all the Catholics are excluded, everybody's excluded who's not in that family from ever becoming head of state. It's a way of doing it, it's just not to my taste or to any Democrat's taste.
Kate, let me come back to you. I'm just curious to know if, as a British citizen living in the United States, if your views of your royal family have changed in any way or developed in any way because of that.
Yeah, I suppose I've been forced to look at them more than I would have when I was living over there, I think, because there's quite a lot of discussion about it over here. And looking at the whole, I have a much more international perspective now, I suppose. And I just reiterate what I say about how I would like the Queen to even have more say. I just think she's got a wonderful broad outlook.
Peter Hitchens, I mean, how do you feel about that? Should the royal family have even more power?
No, I don't think so. I think that one of the most important points, though, that we have to recognize, when people talk about democracy, they talk about elections. When they talk about elections, they talk about parties and about campaigns and about the raising of money. And as anyone in the United States, and increasingly people in Britain realize, the whole business of raising money for political campaigns makes it very difficult for people to rise above it when they get to power. One of the great things about having a hereditary monarchy is that you don't have that taint of fundraising, soft money, hard money, whatever it is, when you actually get a head of state. They really are genuinely above self-interest, above interests which have campaigned for them, above interests which have paid for them, and they can be an impartial umpire, as I say, at the head of the Constitution. That is extremely valuable. I don't think you could give the Queen more power. I think those days have gone. I don't think anyone's a pure democracy. For heaven's sake, the United States doesn't have direct elections for the Supreme Court, and a number of other parts of the US Constitution are pretty impervious to democracy, and a pure democracy would presumably elect a different government every day. I don't know quite how you could devise a pure democracy. Every democracy has restraints of one kind or another to prevent it being wholly democratic, or it would be chaotic. But no, I think that the important thing about the monarchy is that, first of all, that it's above politics. Secondly, that it can get the loyalty of absolutely everybody without dividing the country. And there's another important thing. You have a separation of powers in the United States, which I think was largely borrowed from us when it was devised. But we have another very interesting separation of powers. During the past 6 months or so, since September the 11th, 9 months now, I think certainly in the initial period, it was very difficult for anyone in the United States to criticize President Bush, even on things which had nothing whatever to do with 9/11. In Britain, that wasn't so. You could criticize Mr. Blair quite happily on practically anything, however much there was an air of crisis about and an air of war against terrorism, precisely because he was the head of government and not the head of state, and you could remain loyal while being critical. I think that's an important extra freedom which a constitutional monarchy has, which a republic with an elected president doesn't have. It has other implications as well, but I won't go on about them here.
Thank you, Kate, for your call. Let's go to Tom, who's calling from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Hi, Tom.
Hello?
Yes, you're on the connection.
Okay. Listen, I wanted to revisit this question of the power of the Queen and remind everybody there of the incident that happened in the 70s in Australia, where the Queen's appointed Governor General of Australia, acting on her power, fired the elected Prime Minister and replaced him with somebody from the other party.
It's a good, actually, I was in Australia not long ago and heard talk of that episode. Stephen Hessler, that's a real concern.
Could I possibly say a word about this one?
Because not only does have power, but she exercised it.
Sure.
Could I possibly say a word
Peter,
about this one?
Go first, but I want to give Stephen Hessler a chance to respond.
Well, I think I need the first go on this because I know what Stephen's going to say, and he's not going to say that the reason why this Prime Minister was fired was because he defied the Australian Constitution, which said that a government which couldn't get supply, that is, it couldn't raise any money because it could get no backing in the Senate, couldn't function constitutionally and had either to call an election or resign. The Prime Minister refused to call an election or resign, which he was obliged to do under the Australian Constitution. The Governor-General constitutionally fired him, as he was constitutionally obliged to do. It was nothing to do with the Queen intervening in Australian politics. It's a great Republican myth.
Stephen Hessler, is that a fair description of what happened from your view?
Well, my own view of this, which I'm now allowed to give, is that this is an example of where a head of state is important in politics. It wasn't the Queen intervening, actually, but it was the head of state intervening in the democratic process. That's why I think the head of state ought to be elected, because they can be controversial at times in the politics of a country, and it's therefore better to have them elected and have them accountable. The problem with our dear Queen is accountable to nobody. She got up in Parliament the other day in an amazing statement. None of the journalists have picked this up here, our great investigative journalists who look after our Constitution. She got up and she announced, she said, "I have a resolve," she said, in that rather tweedy voice. She said, "I have a resolve to carry on." Now, hold on a second. She's our head of state. She's announcing she's going to carry on. Now, don't we have any say in that? I mean, is there nobody here who's a person or a citizen? I know we're subjects, but shouldn't we be consulted about whether she's going to carry on? Here is the problem about our head of state.
Well, Peter Hitchens,
Hold on, let me finish this.
Sure, go ahead.
It represents a system which is not accountable to anybody. Now, it's mired in the mists of history, I understand that, but surely we can grow up now to be a democratic country, warts and all, who can hold even our head of state, our God-given head of state, to some form of accountability. Can't we do that, Peter?
Well, hang on. Look, what's this accountability? Accountability to whom? How does
the people?
How does democracy work? Parliament, regrettably, is not controlled by the people any more than the U.S. Congress is controlled by the people. It's controlled by political parties and by fundraisers. Had we had in Australia at the time when Gough Whitlam was fired an elected head of state who was of the same party of Gough Whitlam, the possibility might well have been that that party would have colluded to defy the Australian Constitution, which is what Gough Whitlam was seeking to do, and it would have made it much, much more dangerous. Because there was an impartial head of state who was not elected, who owed nothing to a political party.
Peter Hitchens, forgive me
for the Constitution.
Listen, Peter is making a marvellous case.
No, wait a minute. I want to just jump in.
No one elected at all.
Gentlemen, I need to retain control of this discussion because we only have a few seconds left, and I want to get Peter Hitchens to just make a final comment responding to Stephen Hassler's overall point. I mean, let's say, and this hasn't been the case, that there was some terrible corruption at the royal level. What could the British people do to oust that corruption?
There is some.
What we did in 1936, which is to get rid of Edward VIII, an unsatisfactory monarch, and also, crucially, what we did in 1688 to get rid of James II, who wanted to be an autocrat, which was the moment when we established our current constitution and our Bill of Rights, on which yours is modelled.
Fair enough. Well, I sense that this is going to be a debate that's going to go on for a little bit longer, but I want to thank you both, Stephen Hassler, Professor of Local Government at London's Guildhall University and Chair of Republic, a non-party group campaigning for an elected head of state. Thank you, Stephen Hassler. And Peter Hitchens, thanks to you, columnist for London's Mail on Sunday newspaper and author of Abolition of Britain. Earlier we spoke with WBUR's Michael Goldfarb. Connection listeners, you can continue the conversation online at www.theconnection.org. Our senior producer is Graham Smith. I'm Anthony Brooks. This is The Connection.